My name is Jeff. I'm one of the pastors here. I want to welcome you all to today's church service. We are going to be continuing our series, which is titled The Gospel According to Moses. I want to invite you to turn in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3, which is the passage on which this teaching is based, and then we're going to get into it. Exodus chapter 3, this is one of the most well-known and famous passages in all of the Bible, and so here we go. Exodus 3, verse 1. The words will be on the screen behind me. I would invite you to follow along. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. And this is the word of the Lord. There's a principle of biblical interpretation. And by the way, if you're reading the Bible at all, if you open the Bible, you're making interpretive decisions about what it says. So we're all biblical interpreters. And one of the key things you're supposed to do as a biblical interpreter is ask questions of the text. When you see something that's challenging or confusing, you want to stop. You want to ask some questions of the text. So today, we're going to ask some questions of this text, but we're also going to do something else. We're going to allow this text to ask some questions of us. Here we have the story of Moses, who is one of the great patriarchs and the hero of both the Jewish and the Christian faith. There are millions of people throughout history the world over that look to Moses as one of the great patriarchs and founders and heroes. And this story shows us something really interesting because Moses, up until this point, if you were here last week, you know that he was raised as a Hebrew until about the age of 4. And so he has knowledge of God. But up until this point in the story, he has yet to have a real personal experience of God. And so what we have here in this text is kind of a blueprint for encountering God. And by way of outline, I want to attend to the constituent parts of this story, which are, for you note takers, the bush, the fire, the angel, and the mission. All right, so bush, fire, angel, mission. Here we go. In verse 4, it says, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, the Hebrew word there means turned aside. Something really curious happened. Moses, he's in the land of Midian. If you were here last week, you know that he killed somebody, and now he's kind of a fugitive from justice. And so he's in the land of Midian. Modern scholars believe that is just to the east of the Red Sea in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, in the middle of the Negev desert. And this text tells us that he had gone very deep into the wilderness, and he was up by the mountain, Mount Horeb. So he's in the middle of gosh darn nowhere. And he encounters something that's very strange and inexplicable. And so he decides that he is going to turn aside. And there's an intentional irony here in the text because he's taken a sort of detour, but Moses' whole life was a detour. If you were here last week, you know that he was born to a Hebrew woman. And the Hebrews at the time were enslaved in Egypt for hundreds and hundreds of years. And the king at the time, we find out his name is Pharaoh, he saw the growing population of Israelites as a threat. And so what he decreed was that whenever an Israelite baby was born, the midwives were to kill that child. And we last week got introduced to these two amazing women, these midwives, who practiced a kind of civil disobedience and kind of conned Pharaoh and were able to spare these Hebrew children. And then Pharaoh kind of has enough, and he says, here's what you're going to do. Anybody, just everybody, you're going to kill the Hebrew baby boys. And so there's incredible oppression going on here. But Moses' whole life was a detour. He was born, and his mother she casts him into the river, but she made for him a little basket covered in pitch. So he floated down the river. He was born a Hebrew, but then he's plucked from the river by Pharaoh's daughter. And he, and through this incredible act of serendipity, Pharaoh's daughter ends up going to get a Hebrew woman who ends up being Moses' mother to act as a wet nurse for him. And then, so he is raised as a Hebrew until the age of 4, and then he is whisked off to the Pharaoh's court. He is raised to be an aristocrat in ancient Egypt. And so his life has taken some detours. And then last week, if you were here, you find out that he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew person, and then he kills that Egyptian and he buries him in the sand. But then he's found out. Somebody's got the goods on him. It's well known that he has murdered someone, and now Pharaoh, he's after Moses, and so Moses flees. His life, again, a detour. This text shows us a kind of blueprint or a roadmap for encountering God, and here's the first takeaway. When you encounter God, it will inevitably seem strange. This is Moses. He's walking, he sees a bush, it's burning, it's not being consumed, and he stops. There's something inexplicable, there's something curious, there's something strange, and he has to be at least true to his own curiosity to the extent that he'll go over and investigate it, right? This is a blueprint for encountering God. And this bears a striking similarity to my story. I was raised in a Roman Catholic household until I was roughly 19 when I joined the military, and I left New York. And when I got out of the military, I stayed in Los Angeles. And one of the first jobs I got as a civilian was I was working in a health club as a personal trainer in Woodland Hills, California, down in the San Fernando Valley. And the primary clientele of this health club were fitness models and porn stars. That's where I encountered God. It's always in the last place you'd expect it. And that's one of the ways that you'll know that it's God, because it's inexplicable, it's curious, there's something odd going on here. And there's a kind of detour that Moses has to take. This is not part of his plan. In the same way, it was not part of my plan either, and it was the last person I expected to meet in Los Angeles. But that is precisely where it happened. So I was in this health club. This is going back 20 some odd years ago, and in this particular gym, everybody's very beautiful, and there were my desk was between the juice bar and the front desk. Never been to a gym, you know that's how it goes. And the girl who worked at the juice bar was the child of missionaries who grew up in the mission field in Tonga, and the girl at the front desk was a pastor's kid. And they would both try to witness to this argumentative, skeptical New Yorker. Like talk about bravery, right? And you know, it was frustrating for them. I'm sure they told me later it was thoroughly frustrating. So what they would do is they would give me books. And one of them handed me Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, which if you've ever read it, it's letters from an older demon to a younger demon about how to corrupt the souls of man. And it was the freakiest, creepiest thing I'd ever read in my life, but it stirred something in me. And then wouldn't you know it, the other gal handed me Mere Christianity, a book she had been assigned at her Christian college, but didn't enjoy very much, so she handed it to me. She's like, maybe you'll like it. Later, I would find out that they sold those two bundled on Amazon. And I began what I can only describe as a sort of existential journey. It was nothing I'd ever expected or anticipated, but nevertheless, in the most unexpected of places, through the most unexpected of means, God was seeking me out. That is one of the canaries in the cage. That is one of the ways that you know that God is moving and that you are experiencing the move of God, because it doesn't happen in a way that you could have forecasted or planned. Just like Moses, this was not a part of his life plan. If you know anything about his story, he flees Egypt, he goes into the land of Midian, he marries a woman named Zipporah, and he becomes a nomadic herdsman. And this, scholars, you can kind of piece together the timeline. The brother's about 70 years old at this point. Can you imagine God coming to you in the later stages of life and saying, okay, I'm going to show up in the most magnificent, inexplicable way, and that interaction is going to change the trajectory of your life. You have to know that this was not a part of his 5-year plan. Yet nevertheless, he encounters something curious and he goes over there. Now we have to ask, what is the story of a Middle Eastern patriarch have to do with me? This is how God still meets people. I've been a pastor for 20-something years, and I've met people who have encountered Jesus in prison cells. I've met people who have encountered Jesus in Muslim countries, and he shows up in unexpected places, in unexpected ways, inexplicably, and that's how you know God is dealing with you, right? And one of the things that we notice here about Moses' story is he had to turn aside. There's a strong indication of the text in verse 3 where it says, I will go over, that he had to cross something, probably a valley or a wadi or something like that. He had to leave his flock, and he had to go investigate something that he saw that was curious and inexplicable. I remember when I was in LA and these poor women were witnessing to me, and they would invite me to church from time to time. And I remember one time I actually agreed to go. And it was a church, and it was over off Topanga Canyon Boulevard off the 118 over there in the San Fernando Valley. And it was a bigger church. And here's what I thought. How strange. You guys went to college, yet you believe this? Okay. I will go observe your strange ritual and evaluate it. And so I agreed to go. And then it was weird. It was totally as weird as I expected it to be. I grew up Catholic, and so that's a very kind of subdued worship style. We stand, we kneel, we stand, we kneel, we go home. And then this service, they had a guy with a goatee and an electric guitar. I was like, I don't know if we roll like that. And then they did this silly game where you had to take your shoes off, and I'm not into frivolity at all. Here's the thing. Halfway through that service, I would have lit myself on fire to get out of there. I thought I could go observe your strange ritual and evaluate it with a sense of sociological detachment. I'm a big boy. I can go. Something had so bothered me in the core of my being existentially that I would have rather lit myself on fire than spend another minute in that room. And when I got to the parking lot, I was thoroughly confused with my own heart. I said, what is going on here? What is this? I don't understand. How could this be? It was curious. I could not wrap my hands around why this weird college youth service with silly games and an electric guitar, why this troubled me so. And this brings me, I will say this. You have to, if you see something curious, if you see something inexplicable, you have to have kind of the same openness that Moses did. You have to be willing to go look. You have to be willing to look under the hood. You've got to be willing to investigate it. Perhaps somebody has shared the grace of Jesus with you at some point. Perhaps you've seen something beautiful in someone else's life, and there's a strong indication that that's the result of their faith in Christ, and you wonder about it, and it's inexplicable, and it's strange, and you're like, how is it that you live in such a way? You've got to check it out. Or perhaps you hear something in a church service on Sunday, and you think, wow, that's particularly challenging. You have two choices. You could dismiss it and go to lunch, which a lot of people do, or you could endeavor to answer your own questions. You can turn aside. You can take the detour that God has laid out in your path. And here's the thing, in my life, let me just say this. I've been in ministry for over 20 years. I've been a Christian for a little longer than that. And it was not a part of my 5-year plan. It was nothing that I had anticipated or expected. And there are still a lot of people that are very curious and confused by this whole thing. My mom being one of them, okay? This was not part of the plan. And that's how you know God is moving, because there are detours. There's a place, there's something that he's doing in your life. There's a curiosity that he arouses in you. There's an existential angst within you. Don't just ascribe it to like being tired or hungry. You've got to look. You've got to turn aside. You have to go. You have to look. You have to hear. You have to try to answer these questions, right? And the reality is that sometimes it's in the darkest moments where God's grace is most evident to us. It's nothing we would have planned. It's nothing you've chosen. That's how you know it's God. One of my favorite stories of conversion, and I quote C.S. Lewis all the time. If you don't know who C.S. Lewis is, he wrote famously the Chronicles of Narnia. But he was one of the great Christian apologists of the 20th century. But he didn't start out as a Christian. He was an atheist. He was an Oxford Don. He was a professor of mythology at Oxford and Cambridge. And he did not believe. He was a skeptic. His very best friend was a man by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien, whose name you may recognize. He wrote Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was a Christian, and Tolkien had shared his faith with Lewis. And Lewis was very dismissive until something inexplicable happened. God put a detour right in his life's path, and he writes it down in his book, Surprised by Joy, and this is what he says. You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen, night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted, even for a second, from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him who I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England. I did not then see what is now the most shining and obvious thing, the divine humility, which will accept a convert even on such terms. For Lewis, that night he met the last person he expected. And that's one of the ways you know that you are having an experience of God. Moses, he was raised a Hebrew. He had the knowledge of God. He knew who God was. But it was at this point in his story that he has the direct experience of God. He experiences a kind of spiritual reality that he had never experienced before. And that moment changed the trajectory of his life. It altered his path in such a way that for the last 3,000 years, millions and millions and millions of people know his story. If this moment had not happened, if he had not been the least bit curious, if he hadn't taken the detour, we wouldn't know his name. Yet, because he was open, because God had moved and he allowed his path to be changed. Now, this very morning, his name is going to be on all of our lips. And the question that this text asks of us is, will you turn aside? Will you turn aside? Because there's a lot of people in our cultural moment that take all these existential questions and they relegate them to some shelf in the corner of their mind. Oh, I don't want to think about eternal things. That makes my head hurt. It makes me nervous. Will you turn aside? God places detours in our life, and that's how you know he's moving. It's nothing you would have chosen for yourself. This was not a part of my 5-year or 10-year plan, but God moved at a point in my life so profoundly that it changed my path forever. And that's how you know. The second aspect of this narrative we want to consider is the fire. The fire. And the fire tells us what an experience of the spiritual reality of God is actually like. The scriptures talk about God in a number of ways. He's like the fall and the spring rains. He is the spotless lamb. He's, a hammer. He's the thunder. Whenever God appears, he often appears as fire. You can go, we're going to look at it in a couple of weeks, when God leads the Israelites out of Egypt into the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey that we've described here. He leads them as a pillar of fire by day and smoke by night. And then if we go a little further on in the story, when Moses encounters and Israel encounters God on the mountain, he comes as fire. And in fact, there's a place in Hebrews 12 where it says, therefore, since we are receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, let us be thankful and so worship God acceptably with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. And so this imagery of fire is very interesting. It's kind of perplexing and confusing. Modern people, we associate fire with hell. That's mostly because of Dante's Inferno, and we're not going to get into it. However, when you see God show up in the scriptures, a lot of times it's fire. What's that about? There's probably no other people group who maybe understand fire and the frightening, destructive aspect of it better than we do. California, I mean, for a couple of years now, it feels like it's just burning down all the time. And I live up in the middle of nowhere in the redwoods, and there's like one road in and out, and you would not believe how paranoid everybody is about fire. Everybody's out there with a weed whacker and a rake all the time. It's a big deal because if there's a fire, we're all going to cook. So we all understand that fire is dangerous. It has tremendous power and destructive ability. But look, here's the irony. I make fires to look at that I don't need. I got a fireplace. One of my favorite things in the world is when the rain's coming down in the wintertime, I'll put a fire in there and snuggle up to one of the kids or something like that, watch Lord of the Rings for the 500th time. That's one of my favorite spots in the world. We make fires that we don't need because they're beautiful. There's probably no better metaphor for God than fire because he's both powerful. In the scriptures, it's always a symbolic of power, energy, destruction, but it's also beautiful. And this is the first glimpse we get of God. Because, people generally speaking it has been said that God made us in his image and we were kind enough to return the favor. Have you heard that? This is something that we do as a kind of impulse and like wishful thinking fulfillment. We kind of create a God that we'd like to serve, right? And for some people, like the kind of the more rigid conservative types, usually they want a God who's holy, a God who is there are rules and there is judgment and wrath if the rules are not followed. Okay. And then on the flip side of the coin, and this is kind of I would say a fairly popular view of God in our late modern era here, is like, we don't like that judgmental God. That was the Old Testament God. We like the New Testament God a lot better. That's a God of love. And so we all in our hearts, and I'd invite you to really just do a little self-evaluation here, are going to tend to emotionally side with one side of that coin. We're going to bifurcate the nature of God. This image of fire shows us that he is both holy, frightening, but he's also beautiful. He's also lovely. And the question is, well, how can he be both of those things? You are having an experience of God. You're encountering the real God when he defies the categories and the boxes that your emotions want to put him in. Where he says here, he says it in verse 14, the name of God. This is the famous name of God. Hebrew people will not even say, this name. They'll say Hashem, which means the name, out of fear of taking the Lord's name in vain. And in Hebrew, it's Eah, Asher, Eah. I am that I am. But the tenses are a little weird because it's in Paleo-Hebrew, and we're not really sure. A lot of commentators say it's actually, I will be who I will be. What is he saying? You can't make me up. You can't impose your expectations on me. You can't put me or pigeonhole me into the box that is simply your own form of wish fulfillment. I will be who I will be. I am both frightening and terrifying and full of wrath and judgment, but I am loving. And I am beautiful. That's how you know you are encountering the real God, because he's almost a contradiction, okay? Now, the reason you actually need this God the God that's described in Exodus 3, the God that we see fully personified in the person and the work of Jesus Christ, is because a God who is just holy, right? God, let's say you serve a God who is just holy but not loving, you will work really hard for that God. You will bend over backwards trying to please that God, and you might convince yourself that you've actually done well. You think, well, I had a great week. I served at the pantry. I gave some money. I didn't flip that guy off in traffic, whatever it was. And you will convince yourself that you're somehow deserving of his love and his mercy. The problem is, there's two sides of that. You will tend to despise people who don't do it quite as well as you. You'll look down at people who are perhaps not as disciplined. And the other thing is, you will be perpetually, if you're honest, you'll be perpetually anxious. Because I might have done well today. I might have actually done really well last week, but what about next week? What about when that guy cuts you off in traffic? So you're always going to be in a place of uncertainty. You're always never going to be sure. You will be either like very consciously or subconsciously plagued by anxiety because you're not able to please this God who is only holy and not loving. Now, if you have maybe, and this is the modern caricature, well, I like the God of love, the God that loves everybody. And, there's an accurate and warm sentiment there, but here's the problem. A God that is only loving and not holy is not actually loving, okay? Would you agree that unless God punishes evil, he's not loving? Unless God vindicates the oppressed, he's not loving. Let me use an example. If one of my kids, let's just say, for example, one of my kids punches another one of my kids in the face, happens weekly, and I do not punish that, there's no discipline associated with that, the kid who got punched is going to be a little upset. Would you agree? I remember when I was a little kid, I didn't plan on sharing this story, but I'm going to. My younger brother, I accidentally reset his Nintendo game, and he got super mad, so he threw a barbecue meat fork at me, and it stuck an inch into my butt, all right? I still have a scar. No, I'm not going to show you. And I remember I had to pull it out, and then I had to limp. My mom was yelling at me because I was bleeding on the carpet. Get out of the house, you're bleeding on the carpet. And his punishment was he wasn't allowed to have a sleepover that week. I thought that was really I thought that was a little, we needed a little justice there. I thought, how is that, okay. There's no justice. If you don't have a God who is holy, he cannot be loving. And by the way, everybody wants, that's our cultural moment. We all want to stand with the oppressed and stand up for human rights. And that is a noble thing. But unless you have a God who is holy, you have no basis for standing up for human rights. Because the only reason that we have any kind of philosophical basis for that is we have a God who is holy. He punishes evil. He rescues the oppressed. If you have a God that doesn't do those things, he's not loving. Okay? And this is why you need the God of the Bible who is both frightening and lovely, is because we all go through things. It's a certainty. It's famously said that you were either headed into a tragedy, going through a tragedy, or coming out of a tragedy. And when the rain comes, and when sickness comes, and when loss comes, you need a God that is loving. You need a God who has poured his blood out for you. And when you look at the plight of the marginalized and the oppressed, and when you consider the martyrs, consider the hundreds of thousands of people who have been martyred for the Christian faith, their blood cries out from the ground. You need a God who is holy. And here, I was reading this week, and I found a really interesting blog post, and it is the last words of known atheists on their deathbeds. And I'm going to read a couple of them now because it really illustrates this point that you really actually need this God who is both beautiful and frightening, who is both holy and loving. Because all of us at some point are going to cry out. And look, this is Thomas Paine. He wrote The Age of Reason. He lived in the late 1800s, and he is one of the people attributed with the rise of secular humanism and atheistic thought in the West. And this is what he said on his deathbed. Stay with me. For God's sake, I cannot bear to be left alone. O Lord, help me. O God, what have I done to suffer so much? What will become of me hereafter? I would give worlds if I had them, that the age of reason had never been published. O Lord, help me. Christ, help me. No, don't leave. Stay with me. Send even a child to stay with me, for I am on the edge of hell here alone. If ever the devil had an agent, I have been that one. Here's Sir Thomas Scott. He was a member of British Parliament, very antagonistic towards the church. This is what he said on his deathbed, his dying words. Until this moment, I thought there was neither God nor hell. Now I know and feel that there are both, and I am doomed to perdition by the just judgment of the Almighty. And then a local boy, Anton LaVey, lived in San Francisco until recently, founded the Church of Satan in America. And these are his dying words. Oh my, what have I done? There is something very wrong. You cannot create a God in the shower that mirrors your own desire for wish fulfillment or somehow solves some emotional problem for you. You need to understand who the God of the scriptures is and worship him and him alone, because there is no other name under heaven through whom men can be saved. And, it's worth mentioning that here, this name of God in Hebrew, it's Ayah, Asher, Ayah. I am who I am. We read it and it just seems syntactically weird. What's going on? The grammar is a little puzzling. Very interesting. I'll encounter people all the time, and you've probably seen some reels to this effect, where people say, well, Jesus never claims to be God in the New Testament. He never says, I am God. There are several 8 famous I am statements in John's gospel where Jesus invokes the holy name of God. And I'll read one of them for us. In John 8:58, it says, very truly I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was born, I am. Now, that might just seem grammatically odd unless you knew what he was invoking, unless you had read Exodus chapter 3 and you thought, oh my goodness, that is the name of God. That is the holy name of God. I am that I am. I will be who I will be. You can't make me up. You can't impose anything on me. You can't put me in a box. I am who I am. Your existence depends on me, and my existence does not depend on you. And Jesus invokes this name, and we know how it was perceived. There's another biblical interpretive principle that a text can never mean what it never meant. And so you have to endeavor to understand what the original hearers heard. And in that moment, he was speaking to Pharisees, and those Pharisees, the religious leaders of his day, tore their clothes in mourning because in their view, that was heresy. And with all due respect, if you don't think that Jesus has invoked the name of God or has described himself as God incarnate, you just haven't learned to read. Jesus is taking the name. Now, you know the real thing. You know the real thing. You're experiencing God when he has you on a path that you never would have chosen. The third aspect of the story that we're going to address is the angel. And the angel shows us a couple of things. It shows us that there's a bigger issue. There's an issue of holiness. The angel, it says, a very interesting verse 2, it says, there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. The angel of the Lord appeared to him. Now, then it gets grammatically odd. After that, it says, and again, we're talking about the same angel. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. If you've been at a Crossroads at all, you might remember when we studied Abraham's life. And it's a very similar language. We have the angel of the Lord showing up, and then all of a sudden, he's addressed as the Lord. And this is very interesting, that taking the shoes off is a sign of worship. Typically, angels do not receive worship. There's a place in Revelation, and that's the very last book in the New Testament, and it's the revelation of Jesus Christ. God gives it to Jesus. Jesus gives it to an angel. The angel tells John, the Apostle John. John encounters this angel, and he, as I assume I would, was very tempted to bow down and worship this angel, because if you've ever read the scriptures, when angels show up, people drop. They're awe-inspiring. They're amazing. And John wants to worship this angel, but the angel says, no, don't worship me. I'm a servant just like you. This angel receives worship. There is something, and you see it in Abraham, that angel of the Lord is addressed as the Lord, and then we looked at it in Judges. Do you remember? There was this shadowy figure, the angel of the Lord, that would show up. And what was interesting about it is even though Israel and the judges themselves had been incredibly disobedient, they had worshiped false gods, they had fallen into idolatry, like the worst scene you can imagine. If you were here through that series, you remember it was pretty nasty. And then this angel of the Lord shows up, and there is no wrath, there is grace, there is patience. And that's what you see here with Moses. Moses, 13 times, between chapters 3 and the end of chapter 4, he complains. He's like, me? You're sending me over there to Pharaoh? I don't know about that. He says, I'm slow of speech. And I don't. So over and over, God is sending Moses back to Pharaoh. Moses is like, here's 13 reasons why I can't go. And then the angel is inexplicably patient. He said, okay, well, I'm going to give you I will be with you. And then he goes on later in the narrative, you find out he's like, I'm going to give you a sign. Your staff is going to turn into a serpent. There's going to be signs and wonders performed. And so God is so patient with him. It's like he's talking with a preschool kid, like, eat your vegetables. It's going to be okay. And so you see just grace and mercy dripping all over the page. We understand that this angel of the Lord is the Lord. And if this is the Lord incarnate, that also means it is the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. And so this is the reason Moses isn't consumed. I want to draw your attention to verse 5, where he says, do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy ground. For the place you are standing. He is standing there. He's already defiled the ground by walking on it with his shoes. So why is he not consumed? Think about it. Fire, that's the image we're given. Why is Moses not consumed? Because the angel of the Lord, Jesus Christ, the grace that he purchased on the cross, worked retroactively through history. This is the reason the judges weren't destroyed. This is the reason God was patient with Abraham. This is the reason God was patient with Moses, because as the grace that Jesus purchased on the cross worked backwards throughout time, retroactively throughout history. This is the reason why the Hebrew scriptures call it his loving kindness. It's chesed. And over, at every point, God's loving kindness seems to overshadow his wrath and his justice. This is why Moses isn't consumed. It's because of Jesus. And this angel in this situation he is mediating the relationship between Moses and God. That's the reason he isn't consumed. And this is what Jesus does on the cross. He mediates the relationship. And on the cross, it's important to note that Jesus doesn't just forgive sins. He atones for them. He atones for them. Do you know why that's important? Atoning is to pay for something, right? And let me use an example. If let's say I get in a car accident and my car is totaled, and that person or that insurance, however it works, they replace my car. No problem, right? It's a one-for-one exchange. The debt is paid. There is now no longer any other debt. If God is perfect, if God is holy, if God is a judge, would you agree that if Jesus paid for the sins, if he atoned for the sins, it would be unjust for God to ask for payment twice? That's important. This is the reason, by the way, why Moses isn't consumed. And this is the reason why Christians no longer need priests in the sense that you see them in the Hebrew scriptures. You do not need somebody else to mediate a relationship between you and God. Dan, myself, everybody on the prayer team, we're happy to pray with you. If you would like to receive Christ as your Lord and Savior today, we would love to pray with you after service. And you can confess that Jesus is Lord. And if you believe in your heart that he is God's Son, risen from the grave, then it says you are saved and his grace is on your life. But there's nothing else that you need to do to get him to love you. The word grace is the word gift. What Lewis read, it's so interesting to me. I wish we planned this stuff, but we don't. The Holy Spirit makes us way better than we should be. But the text Lewis read, Ephesians 2, is for by grace you have been saved through faith. This is the gift of God, so no one can boast. That word, grace, it's the Greek word charis. It means gift. It's a gift. It's given. And it's received through faith. There's nothing you can do to earn it, nothing you can do to deserve it, because Jesus paid the price. And so God cannot demand payment twice for the same thing. There is nothing that you need to do to balance the scales of justice. Jesus did that with his blood. He did it with his matchless life. And all you need to do is believe in him to be saved. And when you come to the end of yourself, that's the prerequisite. That's the prerequisite for an encounter with God. It has been said that the only thing you need to encounter God is nothing, and few people have it. When I was growing up in New York, I was basically a feral child. My dad left when I was 12, and my mom got cancer, and she was laid up for years. And I lived in my car for a while in New York in the winter. I adopted a stray pit bull for warmth. It's a fun story. And then I joined the Marines, and so, and then I've always been self-sufficient, picked myself up by my bootstraps. And for me, encountering God meant that I had to come to a place where I realized I had nothing. I had nothing to offer him. I remember I thought I was a pretty good guy, and then I encountered Jesus, and I realized I was nothing like him. And those two young ladies that shared their faith with me and invited me to church over and over and consistently and persistently. One of those young ladies I ended up marrying, and that's my wife, Allie. We've been married yesterday. It was 22 years. That means she's been married to me more than half her life. I don't know what that means, but it's just interesting. I was in a church service, not unlike this one, and I had been reading C.S. Lewis and asking big questions, and I was kind of at peace before that whole thing started. I was a secular humanist and a hedonist. I thought the aim of my life was to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, and that's where a lot of our contemporaries live. And I thought I was, a pretty good guy. I hadn't committed any felonies lately, put all that stuff behind me. And I was reading and I was studying, and I would talk to anybody who would listen. I remember I was a trainer, and one of my clients was a Jewish rabbi, and he would quote the Old Testament, and it fell on deaf ears. And then my roommate was a surfer, and he would be like, "Bro, it's like a wave." And I would talk to anybody who would listen. And that moment for me was about 18 months of existential angst. And then I found myself sitting in a church service a lot like this one, very unexpectedly. Something had created a detour in my life, and it was not part of the plan. And then I had actually come to a place where I realized I had nothing to offer God, and I didn't have a leg to stand on, because I had enough knowledge of Jesus to know that I was nothing like him, and if he's the standard of goodness and holiness and love, I left a lot to be desired. My previous worldview is that when you die, you push up daisies, but all of a sudden, all this was calling all of that into question, and I realized I had nothing. And then I prayed the simplest prayer of my life, and it was the first prayer of my adult life: "Jesus, are you there?" And in a moment, I knew that he was. And that moment inexorably changed the trajectory of my life. And that is how you know. Finally, the mission. The thing and this is the canary in the cage for us, you will know that you've experienced the spiritual reality of God. You'll know that you have gone beyond simply knowledge of God into experiencing him when he changes the trajectory of your life. This is what he says. He says, go. Go. Go where? Go to Pharaoh, a mass murdering, the ascendant military power of the age, who you have been fleeing as a fugitive for 40 years. Go to him and tell him that you are going to take his labor force, hundreds of thousands of people, and you're going to lead them into the Sinai Peninsula. Go. Go do that. It wasn't anything that he had foreseen or that he had planned. And then God tells him to go. He had an experience of God that was so profound that it altered his path in such a profound way that his name is still on our lips. And it's the same thing he said to Abraham. I'm going to bring you in. He says, I will bless you, and your descendants will number the stars in the sky. Now go. Where? I'll tell you later. And that's what he does. When he shows up to a 12 or 13-year-old little Jewish girl and says that you are going to give birth to the Son of the Most High, it changed it changed the trajectory of her life. And that is why to this day we call her blessed. It wasn't part of her plan. She was probably 12 or 13 years old at the time. She was looking forward to the Passover. She wanted to hang out with her friends. But then she says, may the Lord's will be fulfilled in me. You have the Apostle Paul. Paul didn't start out a Christian. He was a Pharisee named Saul. If you know anything about ancient Israel, the Pharisees were the ruling religious elite. They had all kinds of power. And Saul was, by his own admission in the New Testament, he becomes Paul and he gives a bit of his testimony. He says, I was a Pharisee of Pharisees, zealous for the law, persecuting the church. We read that, and he's really underselling it, like I think I would, but he's underselling it. If you read Acts and you piece it together, he was a mass murderer. He had gone to butcher Christians all over the ancient Near East. He had perjured himself to send Christians to the gallows. This guy ends up encountering the risen Lord Jesus. He experiences a reality of God. This is somebody who had been raised in the church. He knew the scriptures better than any of us. And all of a sudden, something happened, and it changed his path so dramatically that he became the most prolific missionary in all of history, and he wrote most of the New Testament. This is how you know you've encountered God, because your life is different. I've been a pastor for over 20 years. And I see it regularly where people will come into the church and they will get goosebumps during a worship service, or perhaps something said stirs them, or maybe they even get baptized. But their life is not characterized by a dramatic shift in trajectory. There is a mission. And when God calls you, when God shows up into your life, and there is a reality, he sends you on mission. He says, go. And so the lesson and the application here is for us is we should endeavor to see the burning bush, but we should also try to be the burning bush. There should be something that characterizes your life, that creates and elicits curiosity in the people around you. We are in one of the least Christian places in the hemisphere. The western coast of the United States, the Bay Area, Portland, and Seattle are notorious for having the least amount of people who are church-attending Christians. And so it's a statistical reality that you are probably the only one in your neighborhood who's a Christian. You are probably the only one in your workplace who is a Christian. And this text is calling us to be a burning bush. There should be something remarkable about you. There should be something curious about you. And if you want to develop that type of pattern, that type of life, you need to spend time with God. And dare I say, you need to attend church. There's a sort of reverse catechesis that happens. I'm watching, it's more profound than when I was a kid. Now everybody's buried in media, and there's streams just coming in all the time. TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, whatever it is. And so 6 days out of the week, we are experiencing a reverse catechesis. A catechesis is, catechisms were short, memorable theological truths so that lay people could understand Christian doctrine. Right? The shorter Westminster Catechism goes like this: the chief end of man is to know him and glorify him forever. There's a reverse catechesis that happens in our culture where we are being told that you're really just a co-location of molecules. You're just organic matter. One day you're going to die and push up daisies, and nothing you really do is of any kind of consequence. You need to spend time alone with God in order to experience the frightening beauty of who he really is. And you need to be around God's people, because there are 1,000 things that would pull you in another direction. But you need to have a relationship with God through the Bible and through his people. And if you want to stand out starkly against the contrast of our culture, go ahead, tell people that you're a Christian. Go ahead, come out of the closet that you're a Christian. And this is real advice. Tell people you're a Christian in a natural and unforced way. Tell people, and they ask you what you did this weekend, be like, oh yeah, we went to church. Pastor talked about the burning bush. You can catch it on YouTube. Or here's a novel idea. Go serve on the pantry. Show up on a Saturday morning. This church is located in one of the very poorest zip codes in the country. This community that is right behind us, there are a lot of blended families, a lot of ankle monitors, there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of struggle. And these are the people that we serve. If you want to be a burning bush, God puts all of us on mission. He calls you and he blesses you. He shows up in your life in a profound way. Why? So that you can be a blessing to others. You want to burn brightly? Go ahead. Donovan and Judy are going to be out by the donuts today, and they're going to be able to tell you a little bit more about what that means. But you could burn brightly. And when people ask you, what did you do with your Saturday? Do you know how brightly that will shine against the darkness of this place? You're called to be a burning bush. And look, even a burning bush is abstract. But what a privilege, what a position of blessing we are to be living on the other side of the cross. We don't have a burning bush. We don't have the Passover lamb. We have the Lord Jesus Christ. And you can read about him. Read the scriptures. He is holy. He is beautiful. He is frightening. But he is loving. You can read about him. You can look to the cross. You can look to Christ, and you can invite him into your life. And you can have an experience of the spiritual reality of God. And when you do, you will never be the same. This concludes the teaching of God's word.